Hello everyone, I am Demented Kirby, and welcome to my channel, the Commander Tavern. The Commander Tavern is a channel dedicated to my favorite Magic the Gathering format. The Brewery is a series on this channel showcasing my spicy brews and other deck techs. On this episode of The Brewery, I'll be discussing my take on two commanders with partner just recently spoiled from Commander Legends, Alena Untitled Chapter and Halana Untitled Ranger. If you like this deck or any of the cards I'll be mentioning throughout the video, please consider using my TCG Player affiliate link when purchasing those cards. You can find that link down in the description. It'll really help out the channel. A more significant way you can help support the channel is with my Patreon. For just $1 a month, patrons get early access to scheduled videos on YouTube, while higher tier patrons get access to the VIP section of my Discord server as well. You can find a link to both down in the description too. In fact, patrons got a chance to see this video earlier. Alright, let's get back to the episode. Alena is a 4/3 human scout with first strike for 4 generic and 1 red. She has unconditional partner, meaning we can pair her with any other commander that also only has partner. I chose to partner her with Halana because of the synergy they have together. Halana is a 3/4 human archer with reach for 3 generic and 1 green. The reason they pair well together is because of their abilities. Alena has the potential of tapping down for an insane amount of mana if a very strong creature enters the battlefield. Likewise, Halana can deal a ton of damage to any creature equal to the power of a creature entering the battlefield, but you do have to pay 2 generic mana when it triggers. This means that in response to Halana's trigger, you can activate Alena to help pay for it and still have some mana left over. Thanks to pairing these two together, we have a red-green color identity. This means that we can add a bunch of huge creatures that have a cheap casting cost because of their drawback. However, in this deck, the drawback isn't that big of an issue, since what we care about is the mana they can provide as well as the damage. But we'll get into that in a moment. Vexing Devil and Looping Prototype are very cheap to cast and can generate quite the amount of net mana, 3 each, when entering the battlefield. Vexing Devil can also have an opponent take 4 damage if they don't want it to stick around. But after Alena is cured of her summoning sickness, casting any of these can give her enough mana to pay for Halana's ability and still have mana left over. Ball Lightning and Groundbreaker are basically color-shifted versions of each other. Besides synergizing incredibly well with our partner commanders, they're also just good to get out in the game early. If we can get either out on turn 2 or 3, then we're going to be dealing quite a blow to opponents. They do get sacrificed at the end of the turn, but later on we'll see why that's actually a good thing. Same for Phyrexian Soul Gorger and Force of Savagery. Just like the previous 2 elementals, these creatures cost 3 to cast and have a huge power stat at 8 each. More often than not, but not always, Force of Savagery gets sacrificed as a state-based action, but not before it can help Alena tap for 8 red mana or help Halana deal 8 damage to any creature. The Soul Gorger sticks around until your next turn, making it a great blocker. It does have an uncomfortable upkeep cost, but you can always just let it die. Again, we'll see how this is still a good thing later on. Nova Chaser and Hunted Troll are the 4 costed monsters of the deck but have their drawbacks as well. Unless we champion an elemental, then Nova Chaser has to be sacrificed when it enters the battlefield. Fortunately, not before helping Alena tap down for 10 red mana and helping Halana deal 10 damage to any creature. That being said, if cast after Ball Lightning or Groundbreaker, then we could just champion either of those to have Nova Chaser stick around after they do their combat damage. Then, when it leaves the battlefield, that elemental will return in order to once more trigger our commanders. Hunted Troll's drawback is giving an opponent 4 1/1 flyers, but for that trade-off we get an 8/4 that regenerates, that can generate us 8 red mana or deal 8 damage to a creature. Nessian Boar, Gigantosaurus, and Grothama All Devouring are the 5 costed monsters of the deck. Nessian Boar is amazing since it forces an opponent to use all of their available creatures to block it, thus clearing the way for our other fatties. Sure, they draw before damage is dealt, but unless they draw an instant speed answer to their impending doom, then they'll die before benefiting from the draw. Gigantosaurus is just crazy. It doesn't have trample, haste, or any kind of evasion, but don't worry, soon we'll see how we can make those that can attack way more dangerous. Grothama has the potential of also drawing us into a ton of cards. We can just have our fatties fight it when they attack so that it dies before our opponents get a chance to benefit from it. Even then, these monsters pale in comparison to Impervious Great Worm. Since it has Convoke, we can also tap down creatures to reduce its cost. But even then, for 10 mana we get a 16/16 indestructible beater. On top of that, it helps Alena tap for 16 red mana and Halana deal 16 damage to any creature, which is probably enough to kill any other creature on the board. Don't worry, I saved the best for last, Phyrexian Dreadnought. For just 1 generic mana, we can generate 12 red mana and deal 12 damage to any creature, for just 1 mana. If we need to, we can just let it die to its enter the battlefield ability. However, if we've already attacked with Ball Lightning and or Groundbreaker, or have Lupin Prototype on the field or Vexing Devil, etc., then we also have the option to keep it around afterwards. Again, our creatures dying or having to be sacrificed isn't an issue in the deck. Now, the mana these creatures help generate can be used to cast the real monsters of the deck. Emrakul the Promised End, Kozilek Butcher of Truth, Ulamog the Infinite Gyre, Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger, and Void Winnower. Not only are these great to cast much faster thanks to Alena, but if we cheated them onto the battlefield somehow, then she's going to tap for a ton of mana. Either way, we'd rather hard cast these since they have great triggers when they're cast. As for Void Winnower, it's a great piece of hate that can also serve as a beater for the deck. Okay, so now for the final monster of the deck. This one has to be created with Thespian Stage and Dark Depths, but getting Marit Lage on the battlefield is beyond insane. This will deal 20 damage and generate 20 mana. This mana can then be used to easily cast any of the Eldrazi Titans we just saw. It can also be used to cast pretty much anything we want. Either way, we get a 20/20 indestructible flyer afterwards, so there's also that. These are all of the monsters in the deck, so now let's see how we can take even more advantage out of them. For the most part, most of those monsters are basically rituals and creature removal, with some of them being potential beaters, but they're basically used to provide a burst of mana and damage. Even then, we don't have to hardcast them. Quicksilver Amulet and Elvish Piper can be used to cheat any fatty onto the battlefield. They don't have any kind of drawback, so they can stay on the battlefield. Getting these early on and then cheating in a fatty can give us a huge advantage in mana thanks to Alena. Sneak Attack and Ilharg the Razeborn can also be used to cheat in fatties, but we can't keep them like the previous two cards. Even so, Sneak Attack in particular is amazing since it's a red mana sink. For just 1 red mana and not tapping, we can put any creature onto the battlefield. So with enough mana that Alena generated, we can potentially empty out an entire handful of fatties and then swing in with them since they'll have haste. They do get sacrificed at the end of the turn, but that's fine. Ilharg lets us cheat in 1 fatty during our attack step of combat. It then gets bounced back to our hand, which is great since we can then do it all over again next combat's turn. This helps us retrigger our commanders each turn. As for the benefits of bouncing our creatures, Temur Sabertooth also helps with that. This cat is amazing because it doesn't require tapping to activate, and it gains indestructible afterwards. Thanks to Temur Sabertooth, it's possible to bounce back our creatures before they get sacrificed to any clause or effect. Bouncing our fatties can lead to a ton of hijinxes, the least of which is triggering Halana a ton of times to potentially wipe our opponent's board of creatures. We can also retrigger all of our enter the battlefield effects, which we'll see in a moment. Felden of the Third Path is another way to kind of bypass casting costs or the drawbacks of some of these monsters. For just 3 mana and tapping, we can create a token that's a copy of any creature in our graveyard. So if we have Grothama, Bolt Lightning, Phyrexian Dreadnought, etc. in our graveyard, we can just create a copy thanks to Felden and take all the advantages from them all over again. As for the benefits of cheating these creatures, bouncing and getting them back, or pseudo-reanimating them, we can deal even way more damage to our opponents. Terror of the Peaks is a one-sided pandemonium and can be enough to take out an entire opponent or potentially the entire table. If we have a fatty enter the battlefield multiple times or get triggered multiple times with a couple of fatties, then we could just send that damage to an opponent's face. It's also quite the beater itself as a 5/4 flyer. Bloodshot Cyclops can do something similar by flinging creatures at opponents. If the fatty is going to be sacrificed anyways or will get destroyed or exiled for whatever reason, we could just sacrifice it to the Cyclops to deal that much damage to an opponent. We can also combine it with Felden to fling tokens of huge creatures to opponents. Keep in mind that not all of these monsters get sacrificed or aren't really available for attacking. Some of them are. Xenaghost God of Revels further boosts the damage they can deal by giving any of them haste and essentially doubling their power. Just imagine dropping a 16/16 and then giving it haste and making it a 32/32. Ogre Battle Driver and Fires of Yamavaya also give haste to our creatures. Ogre Battle Driver is even better for the deck since it also pumps a creature's power by 2 when it enters the battlefield. So this means that Alena generates 2 more mana than it would normally, and Halana would deal 2 more damage. The creature also gets haste, so it's going to deal quite the amount of damage. Swiftfoot Boots and Lightning Greaves also give haste, but they give protection too. These are more for our commanders and utility creatures to protect them from spot removal. The deck isn't entirely dependent on our commanders, but they are a huge part of the engines that help us win games. As for continuing to make our creatures dangerous, Kessig Wolfrun is a great mana sink. Pretty fitting since our commanders are from Kessig. This will give target creature plus X plus 0 and trample, meaning that we can use all that mana to pump a fatty and give it trample to potentially one-shot an opponent. Another way of taking advantage of our fatties is to draw cards. Garruk's Pack Leader, Garruk's Uprising, and Elemental Bond each trigger whenever a fatty enters the battlefield. Granted, these are synergistic ways to draw cards and won't draw us a card off of each creature that enters the battlefield under our control, but they're still going to draw us a bunch of cards each game because we do have a lot of fatties. They do have the upside of triggering even if the fatty is a token. On the other hand, Soul of the Harvest, Guardian Project, and the Great Henge each draw us a card off of a creature entering the battlefield, but the creature has to be a non-token creature, which is fine since they're also going to draw us a ton of cards during a game. Soul of the Harvest is also quite the fatty, being a 6/6 with trample for 6 mana. The Great Henge also puts a +1/+1 counter on that creature entering the battlefield, and as a bonus, taps for 2 green mana and gains us 2 life when it does. We can further synergize our card draw with Return of the Wild Speaker, Wishcard's Expertise, and Soul's Majesty. With the huge creatures we can have on the battlefield, these will undoubtedly draw us a ton of cards. As always, bonus points for chaining either Return of the Wild Speaker or Soul's Majesty off of Wishcard's Expertise. Greater Good can also do something similar, but you have to sacrifice the creature to draw the cards. We do have to discard 3 cards afterwards, but if we're drawing 10 plus cards, then we should be more than able to sculpt a decent hand thanks to it. Or with Reliquary Tower, we could just avoid having a maximum hand size altogether. This doesn't take up a space in a 2-colored deck, so tapping for colorless isn't an issue here. We can even play cards off of our opponent's libraries with Stolen Strategy and Atali Primal Storm. Oh, and for free. Italia is also a 6/6 for 6 mana, so that's great for what the deck wants to do as well. Thanks to its ability, we can potentially cheat in any fatty from the top of our deck too, so it does do a lot of different things in this deck as well. Alena isn't the only way to generate tons of mana off of our fatties either. Selvala Heart of the Wilds can tap down to generate the same amount of mana of any combination of colors from the greatest power amongst our creatures. As a bonus, she also draws us a card if we control the biggest creature entering the battlefield. Opponents can trigger it too, but I doubt they're packing bigger monsters than us. Also, just like Alena, Selvala also has the potential to generate infinite mana thanks to Umbral Mantle. As long as we can generate more mana than needed to tap and untap these creatures, we can generate infinite mana with them. Additionally, the creature gets +2/+2 until the end of turn each time, so it is possible to make Selvala or Alena have infinite power to also make them one-shot any opponent afterwards as well. We can also get infinite mana with Temur Sabertooth. If all of our creatures have haste, then we can simply bounce Selvala and then activate her for enough mana to bounce her again. Gemstone Array is included to make the most of that unused mana. Sometimes we might just generate more mana than we can do with, so we can just sink it into the Gemstone Array to use later. Yes, we do only get half of it back, but half of it is better than getting nothing. Mana Crypt, Soul Ring, and Birds of Paradise are also included as conventional means of generating mana. These are cheap ways of generating mana, and we don't want to be stuck doing nothing during the early game. Similarly, by now, you should anticipate Farseek, Nature's Lore, and 3 Visits also being in this deck. My disappointment with 3 Visits not being reprinted in Commander Collection Green is completely unsurpassed. Command Tower and Soul Ring, which aren't green, were included but not the much needed 3 Visits reprint. There's no need for a common not on the reserve list to now cost $100, but I digress. Hour of Promise is included as a way to not just get 2 of any lands onto the battlefield, but for those 2 lands to be Thespian Stage and Dark Depths. Unfortunately, they do enter the battlefield tapped, but if not dealt with, we get a 20/20 indestructible flyer next turn. Azusa Lost but Seeking, Minute and Den Wildborn, and Wayward Swordtooth are in the deck to further push the ramp agenda. With the amount of cards we're drawing, these creatures allow us to drop as many lands as we can from our hand to put us in turn 10 by the time the table's at turn 5. Mina and Den also have the added bonus of giving any of our Farhadis trample, which is pretty relevant for those monsters. Speaking of which, the Swordtooth isn't too far behind, being a 5/5 for just 3 mana. With so many permanents in this deck, we're bound to get the city's blessing fairly quickly too. Nalia's intervention can get us a crazy amount of lands into our hand, and not just basic lands either. For the amount of mana that either Selvala or Alena can generate, we can sink it all into this spell to simultaneously fill our hands with lands while thinning the deck of them. We can then play a ton of lands each turn thanks to the aforementioned creatures that let us play more lands. It can also be used to clear the skies of any flyers in case things get too crowded up there and might come our way, so it's also quite the response. Speaking of responses, the deck's running Forge of Vigor in order to deal with any Pillow Fort or other group slug effects that might hinder our strategies. If we don't have to worry about that, then we can just use it to get rid of opponent's Soul Rings and Mana Crypts or other Mana Rocks. Chaos Warp and Beast Within can get rid of any type of permanent at least, also at instant speed, so this can help us deal with any problematic permanent on the battlefield. As for protecting our own board state, you can't really do better than Heroic Intervention. It helps against board wipes and targeted removal as well. With the way the deck works, if anyone were to overload a Cyclonic Rift, then it actually benefits us. Even then, if any of our monsters are destroyed or dealt with, we do have Felden to sort of get them back. Or we can also bounce them in response with Temur Sabertooth. We can also be very disruptive with Blood Moon. You'd be amazed just how many decks get completely hosed by this simple enchantment. There are tons of multicolored commander decks out there and people run very few basics in them. Nothing's more satisfying than locking a control player out of the game and then killing them with fatties before they can deal with Blood Moon. The rest of the deck is just the lands. The deck's running all 8 fetch lands, Taiga, Stomping Ground, Cinderglade, Sheltered Thicket, Rootbound Crag, Spire Garden, Firelit Thicket, and Command Tower, as well as 7 snow-covered mountains and 9 snow-covered forests in case anyone's running anything that benefits us for it. As with all of my deck techs, almost the entirety of the budget is in the mana base, so if you don't have the more expensive fetch lands, Taiga, or Mana Crypt, then budget substitutes are just fine and the deck will still run well enough without them with a considerably much less budget. This brew is just an idea of how to build around Alena and Halana. These commanders don't have partner with, so you can just as easily partner Alena with Thrasios instead, or either of them in any combination of the other. Thanks to Commander Legends, there will be 1,596 potential partner pairs for commanders. I chose these 2 mostly for flavor, but building the deck and testing it, I found that they're actually incredibly powerful together, so I'm glad they were spoiled at the same time. Saying the deck packs a punch is quite the understatement. If you're interested in the deck list of this spicy brew of mine, you can find a link to it down in the description. I would like to thank all my patrons for supporting me, and a quick shout out to all my higher tier patrons, the brewers, for their patronage. I'd also like to thank anyone using my TCG Player affiliate link. That also helps out the channel. And to everyone, thanks for watching this episode of The Brewery on the Commander Tavern. I am Demented Kirby, and happy brewing.